The wind was already biting when they were evicted. It didn't wait for a letter. It didn't knock at the door or leave time to pack right. It simply arrived, with 2 deputies behind it, one of them carrying a folded piece of paper, and the other with his hand resting on his belt like the widow might draw steel just for the insult of being poor. "Miss Parnell," the taller one said, not even looking her in the eyes. "You're trespassing now. Land's been claimed." She didn't cry. Not then. Not even when her daughter Emma, all of 6, asked why the furniture was on the porch and the stove still warm. They had an hour, maybe less. Her boys, Sam and Eli, both thin from more winter than food, moved fast. They grabbed what they could: tools, wool, the water jug, a single quilt, the half bag of flour. What couldn't be carried was left behind, including the cradle her late husband had made for Emma, still sitting in the corner under the one unbroken window. The cradle she couldn't lift because her hands were already full of the child herself. The homestead had been theirs for 4 years, claimed it when the territory first opened, but the papers were never clean, and a richer man from the east decided he wanted cattle to run there. And in Texas, in 1875, a widow with 3 children was the last voice a court cared to hear. They walked till dusk, southward, away from town, away from law and eyes and neighbors who'd looked the other way every time her chimney stopped smoking. She never once begged. They slept under a cedar that night. Frost clung to Emma's curls. Parnell woke up 3 times, once from the sound of a wolf, once from the cold, and once from the terrible clarity that she didn't know where she was going, only that they couldn't go back. It was 3 days before she found it, a small bluff tucked in the folds of a dry creek bed, its rim half hidden by brush and its north side dropping straight into hard clay. The kind of place a body might overlook, the kind of place that could hide a home if a woman were desperate enough to make one with her hands. "I'll dig here," she said. Sam looked at her like she'd gone sun-mad. "We ain't got shovels." "Then we'll use the skillet." He was 12. Just old enough to argue, but not old enough to win. She found a sharp rock, handed it to Eli, and said, "Start scraping." She taught them to clear roots with the claw hammer and pry dirt with the fireplace shovel they'd carried from the old cabin. They dug beneath the overhang first, shallow, just a foot at first, then deeper. She watched the light, studied where the wind moved and where it didn't. At night they slept in the hollow like badgers, curled close for warmth, the quilt pulled over all 4 of them. By the end of the week they had a hole deep enough for 2 children to lie side by side without touching dirt. She used tree limbs to hold up the roof and pulled brush over it until it looked like a pile of windfall and nothing more. No one came looking, not even once. The first fire they lit was small and smoky. They didn't risk it at night. Smoke was a beacon. Instead she used stones heated during the day, wrapped in flannel, tucked near the children's feet. It didn't last all night, but it helped. She rubbed their hands in the dark and whispered stories in a voice that tried not to tremble. She had a plan, even if it was half-formed and born of desperation. She knew this creek bed held more than one secret. The bluff wall wasn't just clay. Further in, it was stone. Not good stone, but enough to support something. And the overhang curved just enough to trap heat. "We're gonna build into it," she told Sam, who was nursing blistered palms. "With what?" "Earth." Eli, just 9, blinked. "You mean dirt?" "No," she said. "I mean warmth." They hollowed the space deeper, dug back into the clay until they hit rock, then sideways, always careful. When the walls were smooth enough, she lined them with woven grass mats and layered pine needles between to keep cold out. The floor was packed hard with boots and fists. She poured water over it, let it freeze, then tamped it again. The ice soaked through and sealed the ground tighter than any board. Above them, the brush and timber grew thicker. She added layers, old blankets stitched together, bark, mud. She used the last of her husband's nails to fix crossbeams, angled to direct rain away. The door was no door at all, just a burlap sack over a cut branch frame, but it kept the heat from fleeing too fast. Emma grew quiet in the cold, not sick, just still, like her little body had decided to wait until spring. Parnell slept with her pressed to her ribs, her own coat spread over both of them. The boys slept at her back. They shared dreams and breath. In the dark, the earth hummed around them. Sometimes she thought of her husband, what he'd say if he saw this pit in the earth they were calling home. He'd been a builder, not a fighter, had come west with dreams and a busted knee that kept him out of any war. He'd died from fever, not bullets. She wondered if that made it worse. She talked to him in whispers when the children slept. "It's holding heat," she'd say. "The bluff curves just right. The air barely moves, but we can breathe. Your girl's still warm come morning." He never answered, of course, but the dirt didn't collapse, and the roof held when the first real snow fell. That was something. By late November, the underground home had a chimney, not a proper one, just a hollow pipe made from scrap tin she found along a dry trail, buried into the wall, and vented upward through a crack. She stuffed moss around it to keep the wind from screaming. It smoked better than she expected. They cooked again. Simple things. Flatbread. Soup made from boiled roots and wild onion. Sometimes the boys brought back rabbit. Once, Sam found a box of oats in a cabin ruin. She'd never asked where. She found ways to seal cracks with mud and sheep's wool stolen from thorns. She traded silence for survival. She'd never been proud of theft, but she was prouder that her children had warmth on their cheeks. One night, a heavy snow came down, harder than anything they'd had in the last 2 years. It was thick as flour and came fast. The wind howled over the rim of the bluff like a thing alive. Parnell waited for the cold to find them, but it never did. She felt the frost claw at the outer brush, then stop. Inside, the earth was warm, not hot, but warmer than outside by 20 degrees or more. The beds they'd made from cedar boughs and burlap stayed dry. The quilt didn't stiffen. Emma didn't wake with purple lips. She cried, finally. Not when they were evicted, not when they walked 3 days with nothing. But then, holding her daughter in a hole dug by hand, realizing that her work had made something the blizzard couldn't take, Sam looked at her confused. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered. "I just didn't think we'd get this far." They didn't speak of it again, but the next morning, the boys went out and brought back more firewood, and Emma laughed for the first time in weeks. They'd made it through something. Not the end, but something. They were still alive, and the wind hadn't reached their beds. Snow fell for 3 days without pause. The world above them became a silence so deep it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. The bluff vanished in drifts. The trail down to their creek bed turned to a slope of white, and still not a single flake crossed the threshold into the hollow that now served as their home. Parnell had never felt rich before, but the way the cold stayed outside made her feel like she owned something again. Not land, not title, not paper, but space. A place with air still soft enough to breathe. A corner of the earth warm enough to keep children alive. The walls she'd packed by hand didn't crack. The roof, buried in snow now, sank a little under the weight, but not enough to panic. She added a new beam every night that week, cutting from a dead cottonwood nearby and dragging it down with Sam while Eli guarded the flame inside. The fire couldn't grow large. That would draw attention, but it burned enough to cook, to dry socks, to keep the fear at bay. Still, the cold wasn't the only thing she worried about. By mid-December, the food began to thin. Even rationed as tightly as she dared, the flour only stretched so far. The roots they'd gathered had shriveled to mush. Rabbit had grown harder to find. The trap line Sam set often came back empty, the ground too frozen for easy digging. Once, he returned with a squirrel frozen stiff in its tracks, but even that wasn't enough to fill all 4 bellies. Parnell didn't eat for a full day, giving what little there was to the children. By the second day, she fainted near the entrance, hitting the packed earth with her shoulder hard enough to bruise. Emma cried until Sam wrapped her up in the quilt and rubbed her hands the way their mother used to. Parnell woke up to the sound of her sons arguing in whispers. "We have to tell her." "No, not yet. She needs to know." She opened her eyes slowly. "Tell me what?" Sam bit his lip. "We found something." It was buried beneath a sheet of ice, where the creek curved east and vanished behind a low ridge. Sam had seen it first, a half-fallen lean-to, mostly hidden by collapsed snow. The roof had caved, and it looked like it hadn't seen a soul in years, but there had been barrels inside. Eli showed her the trail with nervous pride. "We waited to be sure it wasn't nobody's." The lean-to was no more than a hunter's blind, abandoned seasons ago. The barrels were coated in mildew, the wood cracked from age, but inside, beneath old canvas, were salted beans, dried venison, and a tin of lard so solid it had to be hacked out in pieces. It wasn't gold, but it was something, enough to feed them through January if stretched. She looked at her sons, the older one taller now than she remembered, the younger one with cracked fingers and silent pride. "You waited," she said. Sam nodded. "Didn't know if it was safe, but I couldn't wait anymore." She gripped both their shoulders and smiled through her cracked lips. "We'll take it slow, boil everything, make it last." With food came warmth in the form of energy. Emma laughed more. The boys bickered again, a sure sign of returning strength. And Parnell began to build in earnest. They dug a second room, smaller, lower, deeper into the slope, not for sleeping but for storing. She called it the cellar, though it was just an offshoot of the main burrow. It held firewood now, and later bits of scavenged tools, scraps of tin, even a jar of dried berries they'd managed to save. She realized she was doing what her husband used to do, planning, building ahead, dreaming past the next week. That frightened her more than the cold, because when you started to believe in spring, you risked not surviving winter. In early January, tracks appeared, not rabbit or deer, boots. Parnell saw them at dawn, just above the trail, where the bluff met the high rise. 3 sets, too wide for children, too fresh for wandering settlers. She didn't go up that day. She pulled her children inside the tunnel and rolled the burlap door down tight, covered it in snow and pine. They sat silent, not even breathing hard as the wind howled above. She listened for voices, horses, any sign of movement. Nothing came, but the next morning, new tracks overlapped the old. Sam whispered, "Think it's the man who took our house?" "No," she said. See, quieter than her own heartbeat. "He got what he wanted. These are strangers." She started sleeping with the hatchet again. After that, they moved only at dusk. They cooked less. Emma wasn't allowed to speak above a whisper. The boys were forbidden from hunting past the edge of the creek bed. Parnell built a blind above the entrance with pine branches and loose stone, so from 10 paces out it looked like nothing but a rise in the earth. Days passed. The tracks did not return. Then, on a morning when the snow had turned to crust and the air felt almost like February, they found something at the bluff's rim. A small pile of rabbit bones, skinned, gnawed, placed in a neat circle. Parnell stared at it for a long time, not out of superstition. She didn't believe in signs, but something about the neatness made her skin crawl. That's not natural," Sam said. "No," she replied. They buried the bones, burned brush to mask the scent, and reinforced the blind again. She debated moving deeper, but there was nowhere else to go. Not in winter, not with a child too small to walk along. She prayed it was coincidence. She didn't believe that either, but time passed. February came. The worst storms had ended, though the nights were still sharp. The frozen creek began to soften. Water trickled again, slow but real. Emma smiled every morning now. Eli caught a fox in one of the traps and begged to keep its fur. "Too much work to skin," she said. "I'll do it," he answered without even flinching. She let him, because the boy needed a task, and because he was becoming something she both feared and admired, a survivor. March brought thaw and mud. The ground above sagged and wept water, and one wall of the storage burrow collapsed inward. No one was inside, but it destroyed their last tin of lard. Parnell didn't curse. She just sat outside in the cold wind for 10 minutes before going back in to dig again. They reinforced the space with stone and brush. She taught Sam how to test the roof tension by ear, knock it with a stick, listen for hollowness, for tremble. It was knowledge no one had taught her. It had grown inside her since the eviction, like instinct, like hunger made into skill. She never planned to be a builder, but she was one now. That spring, when the snow fully melted, she found the stranger, or rather, what remained. A man, half covered in earth, clothes torn, face eaten down to bone. In his satchel were scraps of cloth, some coins, and a rusted revolver. No badge, and no letters, but near him was a rabbit snare, and in the dirt beside the tree, a faint ring of bone, just like the one left outside her bluff. She didn't bury him, not from cruelty, but from fear. Instead, she took the snare, dismantled it, and spread the bones wide. Whatever he'd been, he wasn't anymore. When they returned to the bluff, the children didn't ask why her hands were shaking. Only Emma, half asleep in her arms that night, whispered, "Are we gonna stay here forever?" Parnell didn't answer right away. She stared at the low roof, at the soot marks above their fire, at the beams blackened with survival. Then she whispered, "We'll stay until this earth forgets we weren't born here." Emma didn't ask again. By the time the first other settlers passed by that spring, looking for land of their own, they saw nothing but a ridge, a creek, and a dense patch of brush. No smoke, no signs. No one suspected 4 people were buried into the earth like seeds waiting for bloom. And that was how she wanted it, because the only warmth that had ever lasted was the kind that came from below. Not stoves, not neighbors, not papers or names, just packed dirt, firelit stone, and the breath of 3 children asleep beside her. Spring didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in through the brush in thin green strands, bled into the creek one thawed trickle at a time, and soaked the walls of their dugout until even the floor sweated in the night. Parnell had been through enough winters to know the danger wasn't over just because snow had melted. Wet killed faster than cold. They didn't move out. They dug deeper. The sleeping space she'd once called a cabin, now little more than a dirt-walled cradle, was still holding warmth, but the moisture made it dangerous. So she began lining the interior with scavenged bark and dried pine pitch. They used rags to absorb dew from the walls, hanging them above the fire by day. The boys helped patch every seam. Emma helped too in her own way, singing soft songs while they worked, little made-up verses about moss and smoke and Mama's secret burrow. Parnell didn't tell her to stop, even if the words made her chest tighten, because Emma had never known anything else, and that meant the girl didn't know shame, didn't see this place as less than a home. It was simply theirs. In April, they met a man. He didn't see them, not really, but he came close. He was hauling gear through the lower pass when Eli spotted him from the ridge. A mule, too skinny for good hauling, and a pack saddle full of nails and rope. Parnell recognized the look of him from 100 other wanderers. Hungry eyes, no ring, clothes a year behind the season, alone. He paused at the creek bed, drank, then walked off toward the east without a glance at the bluff. When he was gone, Sam said, "He had rope. We could have—" "No," Parnell said. "We don't barter with ghosts." Eli asked what that meant. "It means we've made it too far to go risking it now, because even in spring, when the wind was soft and the birds came back, danger still walked on two legs. The man hadn't meant harm, she was sure of that, but she'd seen too many kind men turn cruel the minute they realized a woman lived alone, with food, in a shelter no lawman would ever find. Safety wasn't just hiding, it was remaining forgotten. But the creek bed didn't stay empty. Within 2 weeks, they saw 3 more passers-by. A woman with a donkey, silent and straight-backed, heading west. Then 2 younger men, one limping, the other with a musket slung across his back. They didn't come close, but the message was clear. The valley wasn't theirs anymore. Word had spread, maybe about new land, maybe about gold, maybe nothing more than open ground and water. But whatever had made the winter safe through isolation was now melting away with the snow. Parnell walked the perimeter every day, checked tracks, trapped more aggressively. Sam stayed behind more often, a knife tucked in his waistband. She taught Eli how to throw rocks with speed and force, not for hunting, but for warning. They couldn't vanish entirely, but they could become something no one wanted to bother. The home underground stayed quiet, hidden, covered in brush and ringed with thorns. Parnell added a second entrance, not for escape, but for air, dug low, past the cellar, angling it through rock and tight soil until it opened behind a stand of hawthorn. She taught the children how to crawl it in silence, how to extinguish the fire instantly, how to listen for footsteps different from rabbits. She told them, "If anyone finds the door, you go out the back and you run until you see buzzards. That's where we'll meet." Emma asked, "Why buzzards?" "Because they circle what no one else wants." That May, the storm came. Not snow, not ice, but rain, endless and hard, like the sky had cracked wide open and couldn't shut. It lasted for days. The creek rose until it hissed near the bluff wall. Trees groaned. The bluff itself started weeping, water pouring through the upper clay, soaking into the roof like it wanted to reach their fire. Parnell didn't sleep for 2 nights. She sat beside the main beam and listened. The dirt dripped, the support creaked. Every sound felt like a warning. The children stayed dry. Barely. The cellar flooded, and the tunnel behind sagged. On the 3rd day, she sent Sam out to build a ditch with the fireplace shovel. He dug a trench above the bluff to funnel runoff. It worked. Barely. When the sky finally broke open into pale sun, their roof sagged by a finger's width, and the outer wall was soaked through. But it held. Parnell patched the worst of it, swore at the clay, then wept into her arms when she realized nothing had collapsed. "I should have built it smarter," she muttered. But Sam, now tall as her shoulder, had just said, "You built it warm. That's smarter than most." They weren't invisible much longer. A pair of surveyors came in June, following the creek bed, looking for clearings. One carried a chain and compass, the other kept notes in a leather book. Parnell saw them before they saw her. They didn't find the entrance, but they looked too long at the slope, too long at the brush piled high over one spot, too long at the flat ground in front of it, compacted by footsteps and long use. They didn't say anything, but they left a ribbon tied to a bush, red. Parnell knew what that meant. Someone had claimed this bluff again. That night she sat outside the burrow entrance and stared up at the sky, her coat damp with dew, her hands muddy from re-camouflaging the door. The stars were clear, the air was warm. She hated it, because the warmth meant people would come, and people would ruin what the cold had blessed. Sam sat beside her. "Are we gonna run again?" She didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because part of her didn't want to. This place had been theirs, not on paper, not by deed, but in bone and blood and blister. She'd buried her husband's memory here, raised her children from breath to survival here, watched a girl nearly freeze and then warm again, watched 2 boys become men in silence. No, she wouldn't leave, not unless someone forced her, so she built again, not bigger, but deeper. The red ribbon meant surveyors might return, so she sank the main room by another foot, stole stone from the creek bed to shore up the back wall. She mixed mud with crushed charcoal and straw, forming a kind of crude cement to bind the lowest seams. And most importantly, she built a false door, a decoy 10 feet north of the real entrance, hollowed just enough to make someone think they'd found something. She made it obvious, a broken plank, A smoke stain, footprints nearby. Let them find it. Let them think it was all that was left. Then maybe they'd move on. In July, the valley filled with voices. More settlers, wagons, children. A new camp 3 ridges over, with a flag on a post and a trail beaten down with boots and wheel ruts. Someone had mapped this place. Parnell sent the boys to listen, not speak, just watch. They returned with whispers of claims, cabins, land stakes. No law yet, but law was coming. She knew then they would not remain hidden forever. But that didn't mean they'd surrender. She began gathering stone in earnest. Real stone, not clay. She dug shelves into the bluff wall, stacking the best pieces, made a wall behind their fire to reflect heat and seal off drafts, lined the sleeping area with layered hide, stitched from the fox and rabbit the boys brought in. She taught them how to reinforce, how to dig smart, how to survive a cave-in. It wasn't a lesson from books. It was instinct, hard-earned and cold-tested. Eli asked one night, "What if they make us leave?" "We don't wait for that," she said. "But where would we go?" She looked at the roof, at the old soot stain above their fire. "We go deeper." The next day, she started a tunnel behind the cellar. Not big, not fast, just a slope, angled like a route. Somewhere to go if men came again, with paper and guns. Somewhere hers. Because if they could build into the earth once, they could do it again. And if the earth had held them through the freeze, it would hold them again through whatever storm the warm months brought, because dirt didn't betray, wood rotted, neighbors changed sides, law shifted with the tide of money, but packed clay and stone, those stayed loyal. By mid-July, the bluff felt like it was holding its breath. The trees had thickened along the ridges, smoke curled from distant homestead chimneys, and the new trail, once just a game path, now bore the deep lines of wagon wheels and hoof marks, visible even from the narrow back entrance Parnell had carved into the brush wall weeks before. Men were coming, so were women and children. The land that had once held only snow and wind and a widow hiding her children in the dirt was now becoming something else, something she hadn't consented to, and still she stayed. Parnell no longer feared the rain. The bluff had held. The dugout was tight now, its seams bound with hardened clay, bark, and packed ash. The air was dry. Their fire smoked only when they rushed it. The space no longer smelled of damp cloth or frost-bitten skin, but of pine, foxhide, and warm stone. But it wasn't just survival anymore. It was a question. Do we emerge? Do we let ourselves be seen? The question pulsed in her hands as she planted the first runner beans along the bluff wall, in a line of old cans filled with black soil carried up by bucket. It whispered in her ear as Emma played above ground, braiding twigs into the rabbit traps like it was a game. And it shouted from her spine every time a stranger's voice echoed too close, as when the new neighbors built a shed within earshot and split firewood with a rhythm too human to ignore. They were no longer alone. By August, the first knock came. It wasn't a door, just a voice. "Hello?" A woman's voice, from somewhere just beyond the bluff's outer line. "Saw smoke. Just wondering if someone's about." Parnell crouched behind the brush. Sam was beside her, holding his homemade sling, rock already tucked into the leather. The voice didn't press, just lingered. Then footsteps moved away. That night, Parnell spoke aloud what they'd all felt since spring. "We can't hide forever." Sam stiffened. Eli looked up from his whittling. Emma didn't react. She was asleep in the hammock Parnell had slung from 2 of the sturdiest roof poles. Eli asked, "What's gonna change?" Parnell rubbed her hands together, slower than needed. "The world, maybe. Maybe just this place." She tested the waters slowly, not by emerging herself, not yet, but by leaving things near the trail. A broken spoon, a burnt-out tin, a pile of old wood shavings, as if someone had camped and moved on. Nothing that looked lived in, but enough to let others know someone had been here, that the land was not empty, and the bluff remained undisturbed. The woman returned once, left a small sack near the same place she'd called out. Inside, dried apples and a small linen square with blue threadwork, the kind a frontier woman might make with idle fingers and too much silence. Parnell stared at the linen for a long time, then folded it away into her own sewing kit, the one with the last 3 needles from Missouri. September brought a change in the air. The heat dipped, the sun fell faster. Nights whispered of coming frost, but it wasn't fear that filled Parnell this time. It was readiness. She dug the tunnel deeper, reinforced the false door with more rotted wood to make it look convincingly failed. She lined the back vent with oiled cloth to keep drafts out. And most importantly, she began teaching Emma, not just songs, but the structure. This wall, it leans into the main support. That means even if the dirt gives, this won't collapse. Emma touched the beam, small fingers tracing splinters. "Will it last forever?" "No," Parnell said, "but neither will winter." The bluff gained a reputation, not openly. No one spoke of it in camp meetings or carved it on maps. But the new settlers learned not to camp too close, not out of fear, but respect. The woman who'd left the apples returned again, this time with cloth scraps and a worn set of thimbles. She didn't call out, just set them down and walked on. Parnell left back a woven pouch of rabbit jerky, wrapped tight in birch bark. They never met, but they communicated. It wasn't friendship, it was alliance, wordless and slow. Then came the boy, mid-October. Parnell had just finished sealing the winter fire pit, a small ring of flat stone with a central vent she'd designed from watching how wind moved smoke up the bluff wall, when Eli ran in from above, panting. "There's a kid," he said, "in the woods, crying." Sam was already pulling on boots. Parnell hesitated only a second. "Show me." He was maybe 8, curled near a cottonwood root, sobbing into his knees. His clothes were torn, one boot gone, blood on his lip. They approached slow. Parnell didn't speak until she was within arm's reach. "Are you lost?" He jerked up like a kicked dog, eyes wide, red-rimmed, didn't speak. "Where's your people?" He shook his head, couldn't answer, or wouldn't. It took hours to coax him down the slope. He didn't speak a word, but he followed Emma, who offered him half her bread. Parnell didn't ask why she did it, she just watched. His name was Caleb, from a camp 2 ridges east. Gone walking one morning, looking for a deer his father swore he'd shot. Never came back. Parnell let him stay the night, then the next. By the third, he smiled for the first time, watching Eli tie a loop knot. He tried it himself, fumbled, laughed when he got it wrong. And Parnell realized she couldn't return him, because she didn't know how to prove they weren't outlaws. That this underground cabin wasn't some outlaw hideout, that she hadn't stolen the boy. She waited for someone to come. No one did. Winter fell again, and the wind returned to test the bluff. But the bluff did not move. The winds had tested it before, and Parnell's hands had long since shaped the clay and bark and stone into something not meant to be pretty, or to impress, or even to resemble a house, only to endure. And endure it did. The neighbors had grown used to the idea of someone tucked into that hillside. They called her the widow, if they called her anything at all, not cruelly, just as a fact of the land, the same way you'd speak of a stubborn tree that bent instead of broke, or a rock that no rain could wear smooth. She was there, the kind of presence the earth tolerated because she didn't ask much from it. But the world outside her bluff was shifting, and it wouldn't ask her permission. The new settlers had built a church, just one room, clapboard walls, roof patched in tar and bark. No steeple yet, no bell. But every Sunday they gathered, even in snow, even with mud so thick it pulled boots off. Emma watched them from the ridge above, peeking through the scrub with a silent kind of longing. Parnell saw it in her, that ache to belong, to walk in light instead of shadow. And it scared her more than cold ever had, because Parnell had survived by not needing. But her daughter was growing up, and her eyes were turning outward. "Do you want to go?" she asked one Sunday morning, as Emma plaited her hair with silent care. Emma blinked. "To church?" Parnell nodded. "Can we?" Parnell looked at the hearth. Saw the same blackened stones that had seen every meal, every sickness, every quiet night of singing. Then she looked at the patchwork coat Emma had outgrown. "I'll sew something for you first," she said. "You won't go looking like a ghost." It took a week. The thimbles, gifted by the apple woman, came in handy. So did the last of the blue-threaded linen. Parnell made a dress, not fine, but straight, sturdy, lined for warmth. She stitched care into every seam like it was armor. And when Emma stood in it, all straight-backed and nervous, Parnell realized something painful and proud at once. Her child no longer looked like a creature of the earth. She looked like someone's daughter, like she could belong to the world again. They went together. It wasn't a grand entrance. No one gasped, no one stared, just a few nods. A smile from the apple woman, a space made on a bench. Emma sat quietly, listened. Parnell didn't remember the sermon, only the way her daughter held her hand, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. When they walked back to the bluff that night, Emma was humming something soft, not a hymn, just a note of warmth. Parnell didn't say a word. She just squeezed her hand tighter. That spring, she helped the neighbors dig a well, not because she needed their water. The creek was enough, but because she'd been asked, and because they'd traded her iron nails in exchange for her help. Word had spread that the widow knew how to build under frost, that her bluff stayed warm all last winter, that no child in her home had ever taken sick from cold. She didn't tell them how deep the walls went, or how long she'd scraped clay with nothing but a skillet. But she showed them how to angle their roofs, how to trap rising heat against a rear wall, how to vent smoke without drawing wind. She taught with her hands, not her mouth. That was enough. By midsummer, her bluff wasn't a secret anymore. A few children from the camp came by sometimes. Not many, not loud, but curious. Emma played with them when she could. Sam built a second sling and taught 2 boys how to use it. Eli whittled toy animals and left them near the trail for someone to find. The bluff changed shape, not physically. It still sat beneath its curtain of brush, its mouth tucked behind rock and root. But in spirit, it was no longer only a shelter. It had become a lesson, a possibility, proof that survival wasn't just in stores or strength, but in stubbornness. In making do, a traveler came through in late summer, said he'd heard of a woman who lived through the freeze under the ground. She met him outside, spoke little, listened more. He offered money to draw the design. She refused. He offered more. She still refused. "Why not?" he asked, squinting into the sunlight. Parnell stared at the bluff. "Because you want a map," she said. "But what you need is a reason." He didn't understand. She didn't explain. In the fall, Sam went to help raise a barn across the ridge, came back with a bruised hand and a smile. "Man asked if I was the boy from the ground house," he said. "Told him yes. He gave me nails for free." Parnell raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Said he never forgot how warm our chimney was. They didn't have a chimney, not a proper one, just a pipe and a crack. But the memory was real enough to him, and sometimes that's all people needed. Eli grew quiet that winter, not sullen, just thinking more. One night, as frost tapped the roof and Emma hummed by the fire, he asked, "Are we going to leave here someday?" Parnell stirred the pot. "You want to?" "Don't know," he said. "Just wondering if we have to." She thought about that. "I built this place so no one could take it," she said. "But I didn't build it to keep you." He looked at her. "You can leave," she said. "But not because the world pushed you." Emma turned 12 the next spring. She spent half the day above ground, learning to read from the apple woman, sewing dresses, carrying her mother's name with less shadow and more strength. Parnell watched her grow like a shoot from the stone, something that shouldn't have bloomed but did. Not fragile, adapted, they planted that year. A real garden, not just runners and roots, but squash, beans, even a few tomatoes from seed shared by a neighbor. The bluff had given all it could. Now it was time to give back. One evening, in the soft gold light of a near summer dusk, a man rode by and asked Sam where the house was, the one built into the earth. Sam pointed to the slope. "There," the man blinked. "But I don't see anything," Sam smiled. "That's because you're looking for a roof." Parnell stood beside the fire that night, watching the shadows on the wall. It was the same fire, same stone, same walls packed in sweat and grief. But the feeling had changed. They were no longer buried. They were rooted. Her children would grow past this place, but not without it, because this earth had shaped them, and in return, they had shaped it. The bluff stayed. Through storms, through years, through births and burials and seasons. Neighbors forgot how it started, but they didn't forget who built it. The woman with no land, no deed, just a daughter, 2 boys, and hands that refused to let cold touch their skin. And so it became a story. Evicted with her children, she built a home half underground, and winter never reached their beds, because she never let it, and because some walls don't need paint to protect. They just need love, packed deep into the earth, one handful at a time,